G'day, my name's Gavin and welcome back to the channel. A little while ago you might have seen me do the unboxing of the Viva still, and of course to use that still I've got to make something to put through it. Just before we start, if you like this video please press like and subscribe if you're not subscribed yet. What normally happens when you go to do your first distillation, you might go to your local home brew shop and they will throw a whole heap of products at you. Very expensive products, from turbo yeast to turbo clear, all sorts of things, maybe some dab or yeast nutrient, and all these things will work, but you'll soon see the price goes through the roof. And one of the reasons they can get away with charging such high prices for these things is that spirits are very expensive to buy. But we're making them at home and we can do it the cheap way. Without going through all the history and who made it first and who did what, the easiest way to make the basic alcohol to distill was sugar and water, and it always has been. Of course you can use grains and go the long process, but for beginners the sugar and water wash to make the alcohol is the easiest way. One of the most famous recipes you'll come across, which I'm sure I read about before YouTube was around, was the tomato paste wash. These days referred to as the Birdwatchers Tomato Paste Wash. There was a user in one of the forums called Birdwatchers, and that's where that name comes from. And very basically, a tomato paste wash is sugar, so that can get fermented into the alcohol, your water of course, and you use tomato paste as a yeast nutrient. Yeast nutrient is very important in one of these washes because you're only giving the yeast sugar and water to live off, and you want to be brewing them quite high in alcohol so you don't waste your time, and this can stress the yeast, so you have to look after the yeast. So it's water, sugar and tomato paste as the yeast nutrient, and they use citric acid or lemon juice normally to adjust the pH, and we'll add a little bit of magnesium to help the yeast out as well, usually in the form of Epsom salts. It's very easy to do. Let's have a look. So of course we're going to need a recipe. They are pretty forgiving, but as a beginner you probably want to aim for a starting gravity of about 1060 to 1070. You can go higher, but too high can stress the yeast and cause off flavours and things like that. For beginners, the starting gravity is just a measurement of how much sugar you add to your water, and that starting gravity equates to how much alcohol you're going to end up with at the end of the fermentation. The calculator is very straightforward. I'm not going to go into depth with it. I'll leave a link below. Just one thing to note, you can see where you add the final volume there. For instance, this one says 23 litres. But don't start with 23 litres of water. You might start with 19 or 20 litres of water and you can top it up at the end. We're adding a lot of sugar and that will add to the volume. So you might see me struggling with this setup, but I set it up like this because it was easy to get everything on camera at once. I should have used a slightly bigger pot. I could only fit about 18 to 19 litres in this pot. So we'll call it 19 litres. And I added 0.3 of a gram of sodium metabisulfite just to get rid of the chlorine and chloramines. It's not essential, but I like to do it for all my brews. You could use half a Candem tablet, or you might not worry about it at all. Now I've treated all that water. There's about 2 litres. So I take 3 or 4 litres out and I heat it up, and that'll just make it easier to dissolve tomato paste and some of the other ingredients. So I add my Epsom salts, my citric acid, and some yeast nutrient. You can leave the yeast nutrient out because that's what the tomato paste is for, but since I brew beer, I had some beer yeast nutrient laying around. I thought I'd chuck it in for good measure. Sugar dissolves in cold water perfectly fine. So I add 3 kilos to the large pot. I could have added all the sugar, but I didn't want to overfill the pot. Not only does boiling the water help me dissolve the tomato paste a bit easier, it also makes sure the other ingredients I've added are sanitised, as well as bringing the temperature up before I add the yeast. We want to ferment this around 25, 26 degrees, and most of the year my tap water is nowhere near that. I start transferring some of that sugar and water into the fermenter. Any sort of fermenter will do, clean and sanitised of course. Now I've got some room for the rest of the sugar. I can get that in as well. Now my water's nice and hot. I can add that tomato paste. It's close to 2 tins of tomato paste. I can give that a good stir. I try and dissolve the rest of the sugar. It's not too important. As long as it gets in the fermenter, the yeast will find it. I transfer some more of the sugar solution into the fermenter, so I can pour the hot mix of tomato paste, citric acid and yeast nutrient and mix it into some of that cooler sugar water mix just to bring the temperature down a bit before I add it to the fermenter. and continue transferring. While you do have to be careful with cleanliness and sanitation, it's not as critical as when you're brewing beer. We're going to be throwing a lot of yeast at this very shortly, and the final product's going to be distilled anyway. Now I can pick up the rest and just pour it in. If you don't own a big funnel like these, they're so handy around the brewery. I'll put a QR code on the screen. Sanitize my thermometer, take a quick reading. We're looking for mid to high 20s. 26. That was 26. Just where I wanted it. We can take a reading just to see where our numbers are at. Of course, you can just use a hydrometer. I'm using the Anton Par Smart Ref there if you're wondering. But of course, you don't need anything that fancy. See, that says 1074. It's higher than I wanted. And that's because, as I said earlier, my pot only held probably 18 litres, where I really wanted to start with about 1920. You could add some more water and top it up, but I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to go with it. I added my yeast. You should probably spread it out a bit more even than that, but you can give it a stir anyway. And you might have noticed earlier, that's just bread yeast from the supermarket. pH is important, but if you trust the calculator, you should be in the ballpark. I do have some cheap pH strips here. They'll give you a rough idea. So just like beer, you probably want to be between 5 and 5.6, so the yeast is happy, and I did all right there. Now that's it. That has to go into my fermenting fridge or somewhere warm. As I said, it wants to ferment around 26, 28 degrees, it'd be fine. Like all fermentations, it's good to keep it constant if you can. If not, again, this is nowhere near as critical as beer. I was a litre or two short, that's why my numbers were a bit high, and I fermented it at 26 degrees. This is just, I wouldn't even be half an hour, probably 15, 20 minutes. I've just been sort of cleaning up. Haven't even washed up the stuff, just sort of moved, packed everything up ready to wash. And it looks like it's off already. It's about 8:30 now, it's about 2.5 hours later. There is a pretty thick looking pink krausen going on. Can't see much action happening. There is action, but not as much as you'd expect with a krausen like that. Looks like cauliflower. It's bubbling away. I thought I'd just see how it went, since I haven't done it like this before. I'm pretty lazy. Got one of my bottle fillers just through one of my transfer lines. I didn't want to use a spunding because I'm trying to do this for beginners and they might not have the spunding valve set up, so. Oh, stinky. This is the next morning.
Horrible!
It's only early. Within a few hours you should see some action. Don't panic if you don't. And mine had fermented out in a week. You would expect it to go down lower than beer to 0.99 and just leave it be. It'll be done in about a week or so. Just a word of warning about this ferment, it stinks. It really stinks. It stunk worse than any beer or even lager yeast I'd used before. It wasn't very pleasant, so I'm glad I did it outside.
Horrible!
So just let it ferment out. If you can, cold crash it at the end. That'll help get all the yeast out. If not, leave it another week just for everything to drop out. You don't really want to put too much junk in your still. Once it was finished fermenting and the yeast had dropped out, it looked nice and clear, and I transferred 15 litres of it into a cube, and I'd separated 3.5 litres that I'm going to put through the air still. It went from 1.074 to 0.990, which makes it 11%. So that's it. It's extremely easy. It'll ferment out itself. Keep it nice and warm. It stinks. Don't have it in your bedroom or in your lounge room. But once it's been distilled a couple of times, you won't even notice that at all. I hope that helped, and in the next video I'll show you distilling it in my large Viva system, and I also have a Viva air still as well, so we'll put them both through their paces. So thanks for watching. As I said before, if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything. And if you enjoyed it, please take the time to go and have a look at my Patreon. They've just started a free tier on Patreon. I haven't got much free information up there yet. It's only just started. That won't allow to see you a lot of the bigger, long, full brew day videos, but there'll be things there that you won't see on this normal YouTube channel. And a big thank you goes out to my current Patreon subscribers, because without them I couldn't continue to do these videos. Thanks very much. I'll see you in the next one.
Horrible! Horrible!